Hi, my name's Alice, and as mentioned, I'm the Rivers Advisor at the Trust. And I'm going to be talking about some of our work on rivers, as Ben mentioned, following on from Ben's really interesting talk. So, as I said, my role is the Rivers Advisor, and I sit within the Wilder Landscapes team. So that is kind of section 2 of our conservation work that Ben mentioned, the work within the wider landscape. So within my team, we do all of our work outside of the nature reserves, and we work with farmers, landowners, community groups, individuals, all trying to improve land for nature outside of our reserves. And obviously my work all revolves around rivers. I cover all of the river catchments in Suffolk, working on various projects, and I'll go into some of those projects later on in the presentation. But I wanted to start off with a bit of an introduction and background about the state of our rivers and why this work is important, really. And rivers have been in the news a lot recently in the last couple of years, the plight of rivers, particularly with pollution, sewage pollution. So I think some of these issues are a bit more on the forefront of our mind than perhaps they were a few years ago, which is good. But there's all sorts of issues with our rivers in Suffolk and across the whole of the UK, really, not just pollution. And one of the key things is the modifications and changes that they've gone through throughout history, going way back when humans first started sort of modifying our landscape. And these sort of modifications, whether the river has been diverted or moved to make way for agriculture, or the floodplain has been drained, or the river's been dug to be wider or straighter or deeper than it would naturally be. All of these different kind of modifications mean that all the different sort of microhabitats and niches that would be in a natural river habitat with meanders and pools and riffles and slow-flowing sections and faster-flowing sections have been taken away. And we end up with something like this in the top right there, which is maybe more like a drainage channel. And that was done to carry water from point A to point B as quickly as possible to help with flooding. But it's really uniform, and as I say, all of those different sort of microhabitats have been taken away. A lot of our rivers are disconnected from their floodplain as well, and we can't really separate river from the floodplain. They come together hand in hand. There's lots of artificial flood defences, and in some cases these are needed to protect people and property, towns from flooding. But in the wider landscape, in the upper parts of the catchment where there's more open land, sometimes these rivers are even disconnected from the floodplain because of artificial dredging of the rivers, removing material from the riverbed, depositing it on the riverbank, and that's raising the level of the bank compared to the rest of the floodplain. So the river has to rise even higher to spill out. And where there's space and it's safe to do so, we want those natural processes of flooding to happen, because it helps reduce flooding downstream to protect people and property, but also provide habitats, and it's allowing those natural functions of rivers. There are various barriers to fish migration, so we've got lots of historic mill structures, for example, and weirs in our rivers in Suffolk. And this means that migratory fish like brown trout or eel can't move up and down the river and go to their spawning grounds potentially. I've mentioned pollution, which I think we all know about. There's pollution from sewage works, but also various sources: agricultural runoff, urban areas, domestic areas, road runoff is another big issue we don't always talk about. And all of that is accumulating and building up in the environment. And of course, silt as well. So you can see here the picture at the top. Often in this part of Suffolk, where we've got sort of sandy soils or lighter soils, a lot of that soil material is running off fields if they're left bare in the autumn, winter, after heavy rain, making their way into ditches and eventually rivers, and that will settle on the riverbed, on the vegetation, and can impact the habitat there. Slow and low flows, that's a key issue which we don't often talk about, and that's particular to this region. We're quite a dry part of region of the UK, although we might not always think of it. But we do get a lot less rain than other parts of the UK. And in the summer in particular, lots of our rivers, including the Deben near to here, suffer from low flows and other tributaries dry out, and the river sort of levels drop significantly. And that means there's various issues with increased temperature of the river, reduced oxygen levels impacting fish and invertebrates, and often some of our rivers are supported from sort of groundwater pumps from the Environment Agency into the river to support those over the summer, which lots of people don't know about. So, but without that, then we would lose an important habitat. So that's another key issue we don't speak about, and potentially might get worse as we go forward with climate change. And finally, there's lots of invasive non-native species that impact rivers, like Himalayan balsam, for example. So that's sort of the picture, which is it's quite a sorry picture, but hopefully this is a bit more positive. So this is our vision for rivers in Suffolk that me and my colleagues worked on when I first sort of started my role as Rivers Advisor at the Trust. And this is the vision of how we would like to see our rivers by 2030, which is in line with our 30 by 30 goals of 30% of land and water recovering for nature by 2030. And I'll read it out, sorry, I'll have to look up at the screen. Rivers in Suffolk are naturally functioning with diverse habitats with enough clean water to meet the needs of wildlife and people. Where there is space, rivers are connected to their floodplain and have wild margins, linking habitats across the landscape. Decision makers, local industry, landowners, communities, and individuals all value naturally functioning rivers and floodplains and act to protect them. So that's what we would like to see. But how will we do that? So at the time when we were writing this vision statement, we were also coming up with a strategy of how we will work within river catchments in Suffolk. And previously, before that, a lot of our work on rivers was either sort of focusing on species like water vole, or we were working on river restoration projects, but often we tended to have to rely on working with landowners that were willing to work with us, and also relatively small pots of funding where that was available. So that sort of led to relatively small-scale restoration projects here and there, sort of piecemeal bits of work across Suffolk, rather than having a bit more of a joined-up approach. And those projects were really great for wildlife locally, but potentially weren't helping us meet our larger ambitions of nature recovery. So in our strategy, we decided we needed to work on a larger scale. So we want to develop large and ambitious projects, delivering high-quality work at scale for rivers and wildlife. We want to enable action for rivers through our advice and our training, and we also want to advocate for a positive change for rivers. So that can't just come from my role individually. So some of that work will be throughout the rest of our conservation team, the farm advice team, and Rupert in planning and advocacy, for example. But also, we can't just do this alone as Suffolk Wildlife Trust. So we need to work with other stakeholders, organisations, to achieve the vision that we set out. So as an example of how we're doing that and working on a larger catchment scale, and this is sort of relevant local to here, it's the River Deben From Source to Sea project, which is a relatively new, still in its early stages project, but some of you may have heard of it already. This isn't just a Suffolk Wildlife Trust project. It actually came out of the East Suffolk Catchment Partnership Group, which is a group of different organisations, stakeholders, community groups, landowners, all with an interest in rivers and river restoration, and they're within the catchments of East Suffolk. So the Deben's one of them, the Blythe, Alden Orr, for example. And Suffolk Wildlife Trust engaged with the with the East Suffolk Catchment Partnership in early 2023, and we sort of had a conversation about how we can work together more as a partnership of different stakeholders and groups to deliver a large and ambitious project for rivers. Because previously, all the different organisations were sort of doing our own great work in our own areas and then coming back and reporting as a partnership. But we wanted to see how we could work together more and achieve more. So after that, the partnership had a workshop to discuss priorities, where we thought we could deliver the best outcomes. And the River Deben catchment came up as a priority catchment out of that workshop. And then the River Deben Source to Sea project was born. So a subgroup of organisations, individuals from the catchment partnership then formed the working group for the River Deben Source to Sea project. And I sit on that working group from Suffolk Wildlife Trust, and there's various other organisations, the Environment Agency, the local farmer cluster group, for example. So as I say, I sit on the working group, and since then, since we sort of formed, we've been working on the structure of the project, the different objectives, how it will be governed. And in early this year, the Essex and Suffolk Rivers Trust, who are the host organisation of the partnership, they applied for a funding grant from the River Restoration Fund for the project, and luckily we were successful. So this funded a project manager post and also some money for some pilot projects to deliver work on the ground and some modelling to build our sort of baseline of information. So that's really exciting that things are starting to kick off now. These on the other side are the general themes of the project. We are working across the whole catchment and working with farmers, landowners, industry, communities, individuals to improve water quality, to look at the low flow issues or water resource issues, but also flooding through natural flood management, and also looking to improve habitat connectivity and habitat quality as well across the whole catchment. And as I say, we're still in the early stages so we're sort of moving from the planning stage into starting to deliver stuff on the ground. And with the new project manager post, things are really starting to move. So that's really exciting. Another example of our working at catchment scale is the Blythe and Store Valley modelling work. So in the River Blythe catchment, as Ben mentioned, there's a farmer cluster group that we've been supporting for a number of years. And they last year commissioned this modelling work to look at the different flow pathways of pollutants across the landscape and how they can enter the river. And it also looks at erosion and flooding as well within the wider catchment. So this is one of the maps produced from the modelling work, and this shows the River Blythe catchment as a whole, outlined the whole in red. And what these green areas are, so the model actually looks at the flow pathways of pollutants within the catchment, and then also identifies areas where nature-based solutions, such as creating woodland, wetland, attenuation ponds, or leaky dams, something like this, where these interventions are best placed within the catchment to slow the flow and to filter out pollutants and stop runoff and soil erosion. So these green areas, for example, are where the model suggested woodland might be best, blue areas where wetland creation, and this is just one of the outputs. You can actually zoom in to an individual farm level, and then the farms and landowners can see on their farm where they can best prioritise to do certain interventions. So the farmer might look at this and think, hang on a minute, I'm not going to turn my whole farm into woodland. And there's a saying that all models are wrong, but some are useful, which is maybe the case here. But it's a tool for helping them to prioritise where they are going to invest in these projects. And we're hoping to do the same in the Store Valley catchment, which is a much larger catchment in West Suffolk. And there are 2 farmer cluster groups there and the landscape recovery project that Ben mentioned. So we're hoping to get funding to deliver this modelling work and then go in and work with the farmers and landowners within these different groups and project areas to take it a step further and say, these are where the model suggests, actually, let's go out on your farm and identify project sites where we can put in a pond or create an area of wetland and hopefully identify potential funding sources for them. So that's just another way of working in this sort of catchment scale. Another example is the River Waveney and Gipping vision work. So I'm working on a project on the River Waveney, which is actually an element of our Whirlingham project. And my colleague Helen in the Farm Advice team is doing similar work within the Gipping catchment at the same time. So I'll focus on what I'm doing in the Waveney, but just know there's sort of 2 projects going on. And this is basically in the Waveney. In essence, we're wanting to come up with a vision for the catchment, the whole Waveney catchment from source to sea, about how we can improve it for nature. And that seems quite simple. A vision statement can just be a couple of lines, and we could probably write that in a short time. But the idea is we take that vision and the next steps, and we can take that to funders to develop a fundable catchment scale restoration project. And all of the landscape recovery projects that Ben mentioned started off with a vision, so it's an important first step. But the key thing is in the Waveney that we're working with all the different stakeholders within the catchment to develop this vision, because if we're working on a catchment scale project, it needs to be owned by the community, and it can't just come from one organisation individually, Suffolk Wildlife Trust. And there might be issues within the catchment that certain groups are aware of that we don't know about. And so we're doing some community engagement surveys and workshops, which we're just starting to work on. And we'll have a workshop early next year. And that will help us to identify the key issues within the catchment, which will help us then work out a vision for how we would like to see that improved, which can then be put into a report with next steps, which could then be taken to funders to take on another maybe landscape recovery project or something else. Finally, some other area of my work, because a lot of these projects that I've just talked about, the sort of larger scale, working with communities in the catchment, take a long time to develop and deliver things on the ground. So I have been doing some work on the ground in the meantime with some of those smaller pots of funding that I mentioned, but focusing on one area and working with landowners within one catchment. This is a small tributary, it's called the River Glen, which eventually goes into the Stour. And we've been working with farmers along this watercourse and doing a lot of floodplain restoration work and river restoration work through Environment Agency funding over the last couple of years. And so these are the project areas that we've delivered and plan to deliver this autumn and winter, hopefully. So you can already see that it's sort of joining up the dots, and if we can engage some of the landowners down at the bottom end, then we're already working at a sort of catchment scale. And if you were a wading bird, for example, flying over this landscape and you saw these restored floodplains, then that might be quite attractive to them. Here's an example of some of the work we're doing. So these are wetland scrapes Ben was talking about, these shallow wet habitats. They're really great for invertebrates, wading birds. And here's the river, which, as I've said before, is disconnected from the floodplain. The riverbank, you can't really tell from this image, but the riverbank is much higher than the surrounding floodplain. So we've lowered the riverbank. You can just see we've done a bit of work here in certain areas, just by 30 centimetres or half a metre. But that means that in high flows, the river can spill out into the floodplain. It can support these wet features and also so provide habitat, but also it's helping to hold back flood water in this area which it's safe to do so, and that reduces flooding downstream. So my final slide is this map showing all the different catchments that I've just mentioned. So we've got the Stour Valley, where we're doing the Stour Valley modelling and then working with the different farmer cluster groups. We've got the Gipping, which I mentioned my colleague Helen is working on the Vision project, and I'm working on a Vision project in the River Waveney. And then we have the Deben for the Deben Source to Sea project. So there's room to grow. There's other river catchments in Suffolk, but you can already see that by these relatively small number of projects, but we're working on a catchment scale, we're covering quite a large area of Suffolk already. And as these develop, then hopefully we'll see some large-scale restoration at work. So that's all from me. Thank you very much.